Dietary nitrates and endurance performance. Where do we stand? This is the question we are asking to none other than Dr. Andrew Jones. It goes without saying that Andrew is one of the world authorities in this particular topic, and his research group led some of the initial research on the use of beetroot juice and exercise performance. And that may be why his Twitter handle is AndyBeetroot. But not only beetroot will be the basis of our talk. We're going to be mentioning some other dietary sources of nitrates, what types of efforts may benefit from its ingestion, and what supplementation protocols should we follow. Stay with us to find out in this episode 32 with Andrew Jones. Welcome to Fuel the Pedal podcast. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where and when you are tuning in to Fuel the Pedal. I'm afraid I'm still your host, Gabriel Martins, that Portuguese nutritionist broadcasting from the Spanish capital. And thank you for clicking on whatever platform app you use to listen to Fuel the Pedal. It's really great to have you here with us again. I'm super excited for today's episode, and I really hope you've enjoyed the previous one with Dr. Dana Liss, episode 31, where we talked about the low FODMAPs diet in pro cycling. And I must say that it has been really amazing to receive your positive feedback in the past couple of weeks regarding this episode. The last ones from two nutrition colleagues, Helena Trigueiro, who has been a guest here on the podcast before, talking about RED-S and eating disorders in cyclists, and also James Moran, a performance nutritionist working for the British Cycling and English Institute of Sport, who has been following this podcast from the very beginning. I do appreciate your feedback and all the others I haven't mentioned, and I invite all of you to share with me your impressions, whether they are positive or other aspects you think could be improved to make this podcast even better. You can do that by direct messaging me on Instagram, Twitter, or sending me an email to cycling@fuelthepedal.com. Particularly those of you who have been listening to Fuel the Pedal from the very beginning, I would be very interested in knowing your opinion on the podcast. But enough ramblings. You are here to listen to Andrew Jones talking about all things nitrates and performance in cycling. Now, this episode has been programmed for a while now. I contacted Andrew a few weeks before the lockdown, and it was only a few weeks back now in July where we could finally record this interview. And this was an important topic, I think, since beetroot juice has become so popular among athletes and nutrition professionals alike. And recently, a very well-known supplement brand among endurance athletes has recently launched a range of nitrate supplements that do not use beetroot as the main source, but rhubarb and amaranth. And for this increasing dissemination of nitrate supplements, I believe it's a good timing to launch an episode and have a true expert guiding us through the dosages, the mechanisms, and what type of effort or even rider will benefit from this supplementation, and even how nitrates contained in the diet may contribute to this effect as well. So remember that quantification and the setting you are in do matter when it comes to sports nutrition, in particular when thinking about ergogenic aids, and many things need to be taken into account, such as, are you an amateur looking to improve your performance for your Sunday rides, or are you a pro cyclist looking to reduce the oxygen cost of exercise? Is one tiny portion of grated beetroot lying occasionally in your salad enough to experience effects? These are some of the questions and factors that we'll be considering during today's talk with Dr. Andrew Jones. So sit tight or keep on running, pedaling, or driving, depending on which setting you have chosen to listen to Fuel the Pedal, and enjoy this episode 32, Dietary Nitrates and Endurance Performance. Where do we stand with AndyBeetroot himself? Up next on Fuel the Pedal podcast. And it would seem we finally did it. Welcome to Fuel the Pedal, Andrew. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I know we've been trying to set this up for a little while now, so I'm glad that we finally found the time to get around to it.
Yes, indeed, Andrew. We finally pulled this one off, and it's a real privilege to have you here with us today. So, Andrew, for those who may be less familiar with you, could you please present yourself to the listeners, the research you've been performing in this specific topic, and one thing that I'm particularly curious, how did you become AndyBeetroot on Twitter?
Mm-hmm. That's okay. That's a good place to start. is probably, I'm a physiologist really rather than a nutritionist, although in sports science, physiology and nutrition clearly overlap because we have to have an understanding of energetics and fatigue mechanisms. And of course, we're interested in legal ways by which you can enhance performance, and nutritional ergogenic aids is clearly one aspect of that. So I'm interested in endurance exercise physiology, and obviously that involves oxygen. And so, that takes you into maximal oxygen uptake, higher sustainable oxidative metabolic rates and lactate thresholds, etc. And also economy. How efficient are you when you do submaximal exercise? So in that instance, the less oxygen you use, the more efficient you are. And while perusing journals back in the day when I had more time to do that, I came across a fascinating article by a group from the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, which indicated that when they'd given a group of subjects sodium nitrate to ingest for a few days before an incremental cycle ergometer test, that the VO2, the oxygen cost of cycling at specific submaximal work rates, was, I think, 3 to 5% lower. Now, this was really surprising to me because prior to that, there hadn't really been, certainly no nutritional intervention, and really no intervention at all that could really impact on economy or efficiency. If you're a runner and you train for many, many years, then you can become more economical, but those tend to be biomechanical reasons for that change. If you're doing cycle exercise, then it's much more difficult to change efficiency. And if you do a comparison of elite cyclists versus recreational cyclists, the efficiency is essentially the same. So that got me thinking, well, surely if this nitrate thing can improve efficiency, then it ought to improve performance too. So that's what piqued my initial interest and curiosity, and we went straight on to do a study where we fed subjects nitrate as well. We used beetroot juice as the vehicle. So rather than use the chemical compound, sodium or potassium nitrate, we always prefer to give individuals the more natural source of a substance. So, inorganic nitrate is available in lots of vegetables, especially green leafy vegetables. And beetroot is quite good, and because you can make a juice from it, and it's easier, obviously, to consume a fluid than it is to consume a solid, and you can measure the amount of nitrate that you give people, and so on. So our first study used beetroot juice as the source of the dietary nitrate, and in that first study, kind of to our surprise, we confirmed the results of that study that I mentioned to you by the group from the Karolinska Institute. We also showed that performance was improved, time to exhaustion during high intensity exercise was extended, and that's taken us on a journey over the last 10 years or so, really. And then when Twitter came along, I was actually at a conference with Asker Jukendrup, who was working for Gatorade at that time, and he was keen that we were all on Twitter so that we could promote some of the talks that we were listening to. And just on a whim, I decided that Andy Beetroot might be a reasonable Twitter handle, and it's obviously stuck ever since.
It did stuck for sure, and it's great that you've already provided some highlights about the early findings around the supplementation with beetroot and sort of how everything started. You're already making me save a lot of time. So thanks for that, Andrew, and I can only hope that you're not tired of talking about this topic.
Well, no, because it keeps evolving, so there's always something new to discuss.
Well, I'm relieved to know that, and I'm sure the listeners are too. So, you've already talked a bit about the role that nitrate supplementation may play in exercise performance, and throughout this episode, we'll try and focus specifically in cycling and endurance performance. So, dietary nitrate is growing in popularity as a sports nutrition supplement, in particular in its concentrated formula as a beetroot juice shot, and other novel formulas containing rhubarb and amaranth as well as the main sources. Inorganic nitrate is present in numerous foodstuffs, and it's abundant in green leafy vegetables and beetroot. And it seems to be pretty much accepted that dietary nitrates can enhance performance, and that can be appreciated in the International Olympic Committee consensus statement by Professor Ron Morgan and Sports Nutrition Australia supplement framework as well. But I do feel that some athletes, in particular endurance athletes such as cyclists, might not be aware of the context in which these supplements might be beneficial, what type of effort and what supplementing protocol should be used, and in what scenarios it may or may not be beneficial as any other supplements that are always limitations to consider, of course. And here at Feel the Pedal, we are not in favor of putting any supplement or strategy in a pedestal, but rather have the true experts in their fields explain the research context where such supplements have been used and what has been observed, so that you, as a nutritionist or as an athlete, may use this information adequately. And this is, of course, why we're having today Professor Andrew Jones from the University of Exeter to talk about this topic. So, Andrew, since you've already mentioned some of the early research using beetroot juice and exercise performance, perhaps a good transition ground would be to tell us a bit about the main physiological functions that nitrate may play in the human body.
Yeah, so as you've mentioned, inorganic nitrate is abundant in green leafy vegetables, beetroot, also some fruits. We don't believe it's the nitrate itself that actually, evokes physiological change. It's really what happens to the nitrate once we've consumed it. So we swallow the nitrate, the nitrate concentration in our bloodstream goes up. But then a really important next step is that the nitrate gets into our so-called enterosalivary system, and it gets concentrated in our saliva. And the bacteria in our mouths use the nitrate for their own metabolism. And in so doing, they convert the nitrate into nitrite. So it's sort of become bioactivated through that process. Then over the course of the next several hours, as we continually produce and swallow our saliva, the nitrite in our saliva eventually gets into our intestine, again gets absorbed into our bloodstream, and the plasma nitrite, blood nitrite concentration goes up. And that's what seems to be important. There's some evidence that nitrite itself might have bioactivity, but it's only one step away. You just reduce it, you lose one electron, and you end up with nitric oxide. Now, most people will have heard of nitric oxide. It's a very important physiological signaling molecule which is involved in a wide array of different physiological processes. It's probably best known for its role in vasodilation. So when our endothelial cells release nitric oxide, then that causes the blood vessel to widen. So that can help to deliver more oxygen, more blood to tissues. Simultaneously, it can also reduce resting blood pressure. So I'm sure over the course of today's podcast, we'll be talking mainly about performance in healthy people, but actually the role of nitrate in the diet on cardiovascular risk factors is a really important consideration as well. We know that as people get older, their blood pressure tends to go up, and it's certainly something that's related to adverse cardiovascular events like heart attacks and strokes. And if you could reduce everybody's resting blood pressure, people who are certainly hypertensive, possibly a little bit normotensive, by 3 to 5 millimeters of mercury, then actually the number of heart attacks and strokes would be reduced quite considerably. Now, interestingly, the influence of nitrate on blood pressure depends upon your initial resting blood pressure. So if your blood pressure is already low or very normal, then it's not going to have much effect. But the more hypertensive you are, the bigger the potential drop and therefore benefit you could enjoy. So essentially, it's to do with the nitrate that we consume becomes nitrite and then eventually nitric oxide. And nitric oxide has a whole wealth of different roles. One is in vasodilation, as I've mentioned, but also it has a function in neurotransmission and immune function, in mitochondrial respiration, in skeletal muscle contraction, excitation, contraction, coupling, and so on. So there are effects within the muscle where it may be really important. Now, ordinarily, we can produce nitric oxide through there's an amino acid called L-arginine, and we have enzymes called nitric oxide synthase. So we're generally able to produce nitric oxide anyway, but that particular pathway doesn't function quite so well when there's not sufficient oxygen available. And of course, we know that in skeletal muscle, when you're exercising, that the PO2, the oxygen tension in the muscle, can go quite low. And in that instance, our ability to produce nitric oxide through that canonical L-arginine nitric oxide synthase pathway becomes thwarted. And so to have this backup system where we can simply reduce the nitrite in our bloodstream, which may also be stored in our muscle, to nitric oxide, to have those physiological effects could be really important.
Yeah, those were really some of the initial considerations that I wanted to obtain from you. Although our episode will be essentially focusing on exercise performance and endurance type efforts, there may be some common mechanisms from a health perspective that might be overlapped with exercise performance. But since we are talking about a supplement that, unlike many other ergogenic substances, is always obtained through concentrated dietary sources, perhaps it would be interesting to talk a bit about these dietary sources and factors within each food that may contribute to some of the variations, such as bioavailability. And my point here really is to clarify for the listeners if these dietary sources and the amounts we usually consume them are enough to achieve an ergogenic dose. What do you think, Andrew?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of the bioavailability, I don't think there's been quite so much done on that, but it's certainly the case that we've mentioned already the green leafy vegetables, spinach, rocket, lettuce, kale, those sorts of things have a very high concentration of nitrate in them. So those are the things to focus on. And of course, governments around the world and epidemiologists have recommend that we consume more green leafy vegetables because they contain a lot of things that are potentially good for us. And we think that probably includes the nitrate. Most people don't consume probably enough of those fruits and vegetables per day that are nitrate rich, and therefore the amount of nitrate they consume is surprisingly small. So it's often considerably less than you would get if you took what we typically recommend as a daily, ergogenic level supplement.
Precisely. That was my impression as well. And another issue with nitrates that might be, I think it's really important to just demystify is this dark cloak around nitrate being often associated with cured and processed meats when used as an additive to sort of fix color and delay spoilage and the potential formation of nitrosamines in these foods. So in the context of today's talk, what I think it's important to explain is if the ingestion of nitrate from these vegetable sources poses any plausible risk for athletes or the general population, or it might be the case that the antioxidants that are also present in these vegetable sources of nitrates inhibit any possible toxic substances that might be produced in the process.
Yeah, you said it yourself. We try to measure nitrosamines following nitrate supplementation. You just can't measure any difference. So it would appear that the polyphenols, the antioxidants that are in those food products anyway, would prevent that happening. It shifts it towards the production of nitric oxide. So there doesn't seem to be any evidence at all that that's a risk. In fact, that whole notion that there's a connection between nitrate consumption and increased cancer risk has been challenged in recent times. There's really not much evidence that that's the case in humans. It stems from some rat studies where there was a certain type of cancer in some male rats, which the prevalence of which was higher when real megadoses of nitrate and nitrite were consumed. So, whether this thing is really true for humans is somewhat debated anyway, but it does appear that there's much more benefit to be gained from ensuring that we consume enough nitrate in our diets than there is risk, at least when it comes in its natural form in the shape of green leafy vegetables and some fruits. And by the way, the amount of nitrate that you consume if you ate a salad would be much, much higher than if you were to eat a sausage. The actual amount of nitrate or nitrite that's used in the preservation of meats is actually remarkably small.
Andrew, I love it when guests do what you just did, which is to put things into perspective and provide quantification data. And it's what you just did with the example of eating a sausage versus eating a salad in terms of nitrate concentration. So thanks for that. And there is some new data that I really, really wanted to have your opinion on, Andrew. And so as you've mentioned, one essential aspect for the conversion of nitrate to nitrite is the presence of certain strains of bacteria in the surface of the tongue. And it has become clear that some antibacterial mouthwashes can markedly attenuate this conversion. Not only that, but recent research from Professor Louise Burks' lab showed that just 3 weeks of a low-carb, high-fat ketogenic diet could induce changes in the oral microbiota of elite endurance athletes, in particular in this exact nitrate-reducing bacteria. So, Andrew, I would really love to have your thoughts on this new data. And if in some way athletes undergoing a ketogenic diet could experience experience a reduced response to nitrate supplementation?
Yeah, no, I've been, I know Louise quite well, and we're actually collaborating on follow-up projects related to the microbiome and high fat or versus high carbohydrate diets and elite athletes. So, I'm absolutely on board with that. We had a study done where we looked at high fat versus high carbohydrate diets and combined that with nitrate supplementation. We didn't in that study look at the oral microbiome, but we did find that there did seem to be some interference with the influence of nitrate supplementation when the high-fat diet was consumed. So when we saw Louise's data come out on the oral microbiome, we weren't at all surprised because we speculated that was what was happening. But absolutely, those bacteria are really fundamental to this process. So you could be consuming lots and lots of nitrate in your diet, which could potentially be beneficial for your cardiovascular and metabolic health and or for your athletic performance. But you may not benefit from it at all if you simultaneously use antibacterial mouthwash and eliminate the bacteria that are responsible for that nitrate to nitrite reduction. That initial bioactivation is really important, and those bacteria reside in our mouths and have evolved to be there since the beginning of time, presumably. So, we know how important the gut microbiota is. People forget sometimes that digestion starts in the mouth, and the bacteria that reside there are very important to our health as well. I think it is absolutely something that we ought to pay close attention to. Using mouthwash indiscriminately. People do it automatically sometimes without appreciating the potential negative consequences that might have.
Andrew, and you've just mentioned there that you weren't surprised at all with the results of providing nitrates along with a high-fat diet. And just to close this initial chapter and move on to performance, would you say that there are any other dietary patterns or factors that may inhibit or potentiate this nitrate to nitrite to nitric oxide pathway?
Yeah, we don't know. We have an active research program looking at that at the moment. But, one of the things that we find with nitrate supplementation is that there are certain factors which are related to its efficacy, and that includes aerobic fitness, and I'm sure we'll come on to that. But there's quite a lot of between individual variability, which people don't really understand, whether you're really highly fit or not very fit at all. Some people seem to respond a lot and others don't. Now, in part, that will be to do with how much nitrate you might consume in your diet habitually. But certainly a fraction of that, how large a fraction, we're not really sure, is likely to be related to the type of bacteria that you have in your mouth at any one time. And so trying to understand which of the bacteria that are typically in the human oral cavity are nitrate reducers, that's the first step. But also looking at factors such as fitness and training, age, men versus women, different types of diet, and how that actually impacts the bacteria that reside in the mouth is a really important step. And aging is another thing as well, because if we want people to extract as much benefit as possible from the diet they consume, then presumably they need to have the right bacteria to help that process. And there are potentially good bacteria and bad bacteria, and getting the right balance is really important. And you can't really think of it as an individual strain being good or bad. It's that entire community of bacteria operating together that's beneficial. So understanding what it looks like in the first place, how it can be perturbed, how it can be manipulated to provide the most favorable profile with prebiotics, for example, is certainly a goal that we and others are pursuing at present.
Yes, we're surely going to be digging more into some of those issues, but now that we've covered the fundamentals needed to understand how nitrate works, we can move on to the research regarding the ergogenic potential of dietary nitrates in exercise performance, in particular cycling and endurance type activities. And before getting into the ergogenic doses needed, I would really love to have your thoughts on a couple of things. So you've already told us about some of the early findings, but what would you say that is the duration and type of efforts that would benefit from nitrate supplementation, and what does the research in cyclists show us so far?
Okay, there's a lot of stuff in that question to try to unpack. I mean, I described at the beginning of the podcast that one of the early observations was that the oxygen cost of submaximal exercise can be lower when people have consumed nitrate in advance. So in other words, their efficiency or economy has improved, and there are various possible mechanisms that might explain that. if you got improved economy, then you would, or efficiency, you would expect endurance performance to be improved. And a lot of the early studies did actually show that that was the case. As the studies have proceeded, I think it's become evident that if you're fitter, if you have a higher aerobic fitness, let's say you're VO2 max, or you're an elite athlete, cyclist, or an elite triathlete or runner, then you might not benefit quite so much. On average, the effects are less, and that's presumably because you're already consuming more nitrate. You have a different muscle fiber type profile, and that seems to be related to the efficacy of nitrate. You're probably generating a lot of nitric oxide already through regular systems. You've got well oxygenated muscles. You've got lots of mitochondria. There's various reasons why it may be a little bit less effective. That said, there are plenty of elite endurance athletes who genuinely believe that it's beneficial for them. And there may be some advantage to supporting training, for example. It's certainly not going to do you any harm. That's the other thing to consider as far as that goes. Now, actually, over the last 4 or 5 years, I would say, the literature has changed somewhat. I mean, because nitric oxide is such a ubiquitous molecule, it does seem to affect muscle contraction function independently of its effects on efficiency. So there have been studies generated which show that nitrate can improve sprint speed, multiple sprint performance, so high intensity intermittent activity, muscle power. And that indicates that there may be benefits in much shorter events as well. And perhaps, even if you're doing a long duration, low intensity endurance activity, very often in competition, there are episodes where the intensity is higher. There may be a sprint finish, or there may be a hill that you encounter, or whatever. So there may be some advantages there as well. I mean, there was a meta-analysis done quite recently, just recently published, which was quite interesting in terms of the evidence with regard to dose and the type of duration of supplementation, but also the intensity and duration of the activity. And actually, there was pretty good evidence that it could be beneficial right across the board. Exercise of less than 5 minutes, right up to more than 15 minutes. Exactly where it ends, we're not really sure. That the longer the duration and the lower the intensity, the less likely you would imagine nitrate would be to be effective, simply because the intensity is lower and the requirement to generate nitric oxide in a, if you like, hypoxic muscle would be much less.
So just to clarify this for the listeners, it is duration dependent and intensity dependent. So when conditions where muscle hypoxia is a limiting factor to sustain intensity, that's when nitrate provision can prove beneficial. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I think that's right. But interestingly as well, I mean, there haven't been that many studies done on longer duration exercise either. They're just much more difficult to manage. There aren't so many people who are keen to come to the lab and do 2 or 3 hours of exercise. You can usually get some people to do 10 minutes for you or 20 minutes, but when it's repeated bouts of 2 or 3 hours of exercise, it's a little bit more demanding to have the subjects volunteer. We did do one study where we actually gave people nitrate while they exercised. It was a 2-hour cycle test, and in that study we did show that the drift in VO2, the upward drift in VO2 that you ordinarily see, was attenuated. Muscle glycogen stores weren't used quite as rapidly. So while we didn't have a performance test within that would indicate that perhaps there could be some benefits to be had. We know now that when you exercise, nitrate in the muscle seems to fall. So having a high nitrate concentration in muscle before you start exercise, irrespective of the duration and intensity, might be useful. I mean, even though we're going for 10 years, there's still plenty of studies that we need to do collectively to try to tease out exactly where and when there might be some benefits. As much as anything, I think it's really a case of trial and error, and cyclists can often tell for themselves in their own day-to-day training whether they feel it's beneficial for them. But we need the controlled studies as well, and we're in the process of trying to conduct those gradually.
Yeah, for sure. Studies with longer duration would be much more complicated to do, and application in cycling may be limited due to its high duration. But similarly, although cycling racing has really long-lasting stages, there are moments of high intensity and short bursts of power that need to be produced, and it's not a non-stop continuous effort. So it may be that in some of these situations, nitrates could play an important role. And Andrew, there is something that perhaps would have made much more sense to ask before, but I can't let this one fade away. Would you say that athletes who already consume a regular amount of dietary nitrate from the different food sources you've mentioned could experience less of an ergogenic benefit from its supplementation?
Yeah, because we've done dose-response relationships, and there's a certain minimum amount of nitrate that you need to take to have any chance of seeing some effects, but there's a ceiling as well. So if you're already consuming a high nitrate diet, which is easier said than done, mind you. I mean, it's not impossible. If you were a vegetarian and you were eating plenty of green leafy vegetables, a couple of times per day, then you might meet the requirement to have ergogenic effects from the nitrate that you can consume, but it's relatively rare, actually. So, but that doesn't mean to say that the more nitrate you consume, the better. We find that there is an optimal beyond which, if you double or treble the amount of nitrate you take, you don't get more and more effect. There seems to be a minimum amount that's required, but a ceiling as well, above which you can continue to consume nitrate, but you wouldn't expect there to be a one-on-one improvement in performance as a consequence.
Yes, and that's the point I really wanted to emphasize in this discussion with you, Andrew, and please by all means jump in if I say something inaccurate, because we may be able to consume close to an ergogenic dose in a day if we eat, let's say, a big rocket salad with beetroot, for example, or other green leafy vegetables, but on the next day or the next 2 days, I might barely consume any nitrate at all or small amounts. So my point is, in most cases, this is perhaps a very, let's call it, intermittent consumption. And my question here really is, for how long can our stores maintain or store the levels of nitrates, in this case nitrites, considering this intermittent consumption in order to obtain an ergogenic benefit?
Yeah, because, it depends on the compartment of the body that you're interested in. I mean, until recently, we and others just measured the nitrate and nitrite content of the blood. And we know that if you, let's say we ate a salad now, then the nitrate and nitrite in our blood would peak within 2 to 3 hours, and then it would gradually fall over time until after 24 hours it's right back down to baseline. So if you ate a salad on day one and then you didn't have anything on day two, then your blood levels would be, it's a relatively short-lasting effect. So if you want to maintain high circulating nitrate and nitrite, then you need to be consuming the nitrate in your diet pretty regularly. So, rather than have this hit and miss thing where you have a big day and then you don't eat much for 2 or 3 days, then you'd need to be a bit more consistent with it. But interestingly, what we've discovered now is that the skeletal muscle is a big store of nitrate, and the dynamics by which, we haven't done the dose-response relationship or the pharmacokinetics of skeletal muscle nitrate. We know what happens in blood very well. We don't know really what happens in muscle. And it might be that the muscle is there as a backup. So when you eat the nitrate on day one, some of that nitrate is taken up by your muscle and is stored there, maybe bolstering the reservoir that's in existence. And then on the days when you're not eating enough nitrate, then some of the nitrate in your muscle could actually be released into the bloodstream to help support NO-related metabolism or vasodilation as and when you might require it. But lots more work needs to be done on that. We do know that the muscle nitrate store is very sensitive to diet. So if you don't eat nitrate for, say, 7 days, then the nitrate in your muscle starts to fall with time. If you consume a high nitrate diet, so let's say you start to supplement, then we know that the nitrate in your muscle goes up. So there does seem to be a relationship between dietary nitrate intake and skeletal muscle nitrate storage. But a very interesting study, and by the way, most of this is done in rats and mice so far, not in humans. But there was a study which showed that if a rat is deprived of nitrate for several days, and then nitrate is reintroduced into the diet, then you get supercompensation, that the amount of nitrate stored in the muscle really goes through the roof. And I think that's really fascinating. It reminds me of what we see with muscle glycogen and carbohydrate consumption. If you've starved yourself of carbohydrate for a few days and then you go on a high carbohydrate diet, then you can store more glycogen in the muscle than is ordinarily the case. And that's what marathon runners used to do prior to big events. When nitrate in the diet and nitrate stored in muscle seems to follow a similar sort of pattern, which I think is interesting. It certainly suggests to me that muscle likes to have sufficient, lots of nitrate available. And if it feels like it has the potential to be starved of it, then when that nitrate becomes re-available, then it acts like a bit of a sponge and stores as much of it as possible, just in case that same challenge occurs in the future. So what we do, so as I say, how much you eat in your diet and how sporadic that is might influence muscle nitrate stores differently to what we've typically quantified in the blood.
Yeah, that really is fascinating to know that the muscle might be that sensitive to fluctuations in the nitrate stores, as you've mentioned, and sort of likes having a nitrate reservoir. And in the absence of it, much like with glycogen, it tends to supercompensate. But let's hope for research in humans to be performed so we can understand the exact mechanisms. And who knows if in 5 to 10 years we are performing nitrate supercompensation protocols. So moving on, Andrew, one particular fact that I find interesting is that when looking at the total body of research in endurance performance, at least until 2017, trials using time to exhaustion protocols often found superior effects when compared to time trial protocols. Why do you think this happens, and what could this mean in terms of practical application?
Yeah, that is an interesting one. I'm not quite sure how to interpret that, really. I do think, those time to exhaustion tests have often been criticized for not being very real world. Because obviously in the real world, there's no event where you hold a particular work rate and go for as long as you can. You don't get a gold medal for achieving that, and it's more about running or cycling a certain distance as quickly as possible. But I do think those time to exhaustion protocols are very sensitive. You can certainly exaggerate if there's an ergogenic effect to be found. You're more likely to find it with that approach. So, for example, in some of our early beetroot juice studies, we were finding 15 to 20% improvements in time to exhaustion. But that doesn't mean to say that you'd get a 15 to 20% reduction in the time to complete a given distance. Far from it. It's more like a 1 to 2% improvement. And in fact, where studies have looked at time trial performance, where they've given the right dose and they've got, if you like, the right type of athlete, and the trial is over the right duration and intensity, then 1 to 2% is typically what we find. Anything more than that, and it just seems too far-fetched, to be honest. But humans are variable. Even if you try and control as much as you can, you do get day-to-day variability. And I think when you have a small number of subjects and you've got so many other factors involved, then it isn't surprising that we find some people improve, some people have a bad day, and on average, when you look at the mean results and do your t-test, then there can be no significant difference. That's why the meta-analyses are actually quite interesting, and I've mentioned this one by Jack Senefeld, which is published quite recently in Medicine and Science and Sports and Exercise, and they look at it's really a combination probably of time trials and time to exhaustion, but it doesn't seem to matter too much. There is a clear ergogenic effect when I think they've got about 65 studies that they look at, and there does seem to be an effect there. So I just think sometimes the sensitivity of detecting these relatively small differences that you would expect to accrue from a particular intervention, they can be extremely difficult to detect, even if they exist.
Got it. And this is really important for the listeners to know that this is mainly an effect of the test sensitivity to a certain protocol, and that there is an ergogenic benefit in time trial-like scenarios as well. So now that we got the main physiological effects, we could move on to the ergogenic doses for these effects to be observed in athletes. So in our athletes, if possible, our cyclists want to benefit from nitrate supplementation. What ergogenic doses appear to be beneficial? And perhaps it would be interesting to get into the still ongoing debate. Well, I really don't know if it's an actual debate or not, but regarding the acute versus chronic supplementation protocols. What is your opinion on this, Andrew?
Yeah, well, I'm going to refer to that meta-analysis again because it's it's right up to date, and it's really quite useful. I mean, there are so many studies that have been done in this field now, and some are positive and some are negative, and it can be very difficult to tease out what the truth is, and that's where meta-analysis can be really helpful. So one of the things they looked at was the dose of nitrate that can be beneficial, and what they showed very clearly is that when you take less than 5 millimoles of nitrate, then you might expect there'll be no effect on average. So that was clear, but more than 5, so we're talking sort of 6 to 10 millimoles of nitrate per day or as a dose does seem to be beneficial. If you take more than that, it doesn't make it any more beneficial. So that seems to be some kind of threshold of around 5 or 6 millimoles per day or per dose is the crucial thing. Whether it's given acute or chronically doesn't seem to make quite so much difference. So again, they split the studies according to those that had given the nitrate acutely and those that had given it chronically. But in both cases, it didn't matter whether it was on one day or one acute consumption or several days or more than 7 days, the effect was still there. So that's quite interesting. Anecdotally, our own viewpoint is that if you want to be absolutely certain or more certain that you're going to get an effect, then you might want to do both. We do think that giving nitrate acutely on the day of competition is going to be useful, but to be absolutely sure you've got enough store of nitrate in the muscle, then you might want to start 2 or 3 days prior to that. The other thing that's important is the timing of the final dose before the competition. So again, in that meta-analysis, it shows that if that nitrate dose is taken too close to the start of the event, so within 90 minutes of the start of the exercise trial, then you're not going to see an effect. You need to be taking it 2 to 3 hours prior to the start of the exercise, and presumably that's because it takes that amount of time for the nitrate to be converted into nitrite by the bacteria, and for the nitrite concentration in the blood and perhaps the muscle to be sufficiently elevated.
Andrew, I would just ask you to make the conversion to milligrams, because the studies are of course performed using millimoles, but then the nitrate in the supplements is in milligrams. So to how much exactly does this ergogenic dose you've mentioned in millimole correspond in milligrams?
Well, so 5 to 6 millimoles, which is what we think is the appropriate dose for ergogenicity, is equivalent to around 300 milligrams, which in turn is equivalent to about 250 to 300 grams of a nitrate-rich vegetable. So, 5 to 10 millimoles, you're talking 300 to 600 milligrams would be the range in which you might expect there to be some effects, and more than that isn't necessary.
Great, so we can say that most supplements in the shot form already provide a nitrate concentration between these values, but it's always good to double check, right?
Yeah, they should do. I mean, unfortunately, you do still see lots of studies published where, and they should, the authors should know better than this, but they're only providing relatively small doses. They're giving 4 millimoles acutely, and then there's no effect. Well, they should have known there's going to be no effect. You're not giving the supplement the opportunity to have an effect. So, that is definitely one thing to consider. You would hope that the supplements that are on the market would take that research into account, but you might want to double check it, or you might want to take 2 of the supplements if there isn't sufficient in it.
Andrew, again, this is something that I should have asked before when talking about the dietary sources, but it just popped into my mind now that we are talking about ergogenic doses, because we are still not telling the listeners how much, or in this case, how many beetroots, for example, should they eat in order to reach the ergogenic dose. And the reason for me to insist on this point is due to, a lot of content on social media just putting pretty images of beetroot saying that they're rich in nitrates, period, no quantification whatsoever. And we're not telling how much do we need in order to obtain such an ergogenic dose, and if the cooking process, for example, affects, and in the case of, boiling a beetroot, for example, versus eating it raw. And I don't know in other countries, but here in Spain, for example, if anyone eats a beetroot, it's typically boiled and it comes pre-packed in vacuum. And if it's raw, again, it's a tiny portion, mostly grated in a salad. So I think it's really important to insist in this and just make it clear for who's listening to us if this is feasible in the amounts we usually eat it. So, Andrew, could we just go back a bit and talk about this, please?
Well, yeah. So interestingly, although like we've discussed already, certain vegetables have high concentrations on average. So spinach, lettuce, rocket, beetroot, and so on, it actually varies quite a lot over the course of the year, and the place in which the vegetable was grown, and how long it's been on the shelf, and whether you eat it raw or cook it, whatever. There's lots of variability in it. But on average, the you'd need to eat about 3 medium beetroots to get the equivalent dose. And it would be, raw. You can cook them, but you could bake them or roast them, but don't boil them, because the nitrate leaches out of the vegetable, then out of the beetroot into the cooking water. Or it's around, as I mentioned already, about 250 or 300 grams of salad leaves or rocket, which is quite a lot to actually try to consume.
Thanks for that, Andrew. So it's really easier said than done, and clearly one thing is to consider achieving an ergogenic dose through food, and another very different thing is to consume it in a very practical, convenient, and most of all concentrated form through a nitrate shot that nowadays can be done with a beetroot concentrated shot, or other recently available shot forms from other sources such as amaranth or rhubarb in doses between the range that you've just mentioned, between 300 and 600 milligrams. But this doesn't mean that consuming dietary sources is not interesting. It surely is to maintain a stable nitrate ingestion, but again, quantification matters. And Andrew, we're talking about absolute numbers here in millimoles or milligrams, not adjusted to body weight. So can we just assume these values, or there is any need to adjust them to the athlete's weight?
Yeah, it doesn't. Interestingly, although other ergogenic aids are reported in milligrams per kilogram of body mass, that isn't typically done with nitrate. We don't know why, especially. You'd expect it to be the same, but it doesn't seem to matter to quite the same extent. We are talking in absolute amounts here. That said, it kind of stands to reason that if obviously we're talking about cyclists today, but if you were a heavyweight rower or a rugby player, then perhaps you might need a dose of nitrate that's towards the higher end, maybe 8 or 10 millimoles or 600 plus milligrams, than if you were a gymnast or a small female soccer player. People who are lighter presumably could be at the lower end of that range, but it hasn't been divvied up like that particularly, and it might be because most of the subjects in the studies have been probably endurance athletes in the sort of 65 to 80 kilogram range. And I must say there have been relatively few studies done with females so far, and nitrate isn't alone in that. Most studies in sports science are typically done just with men or with mixed sexes, and we do desperately need more studies done with females. And it might well be the case that in females, if they're lighter, then they may benefit from less nitrate than the amounts that we've been quoting today.
Something that has been reinforced in many occasions by many guests here on Fuel the Pedal before, the need for more studies with female athlete populations, and we'll get to that exact question in this episode, if women can benefit in the same way as men. But before that, and since we are now talking about the supplemental forms, there is a research that has quantified the amount of nitrates in several beetroot juice supplements. For those of you interested, the name gives it away. What is in your beetroot juice? Nitrate and nitrite content of beet juice products marketed for athletes by Gallardo and Kogan, and the authors found that some of the supplements analyzed were below the claimed amount of nitrate, while others were below the minimal effective dose. So would you say that there is an issue when purchasing a beetroot supplement, and if by checking if the supplement has the Informed Sports certification, for example, can contribute to guarantee that we get what we pay for?
Yeah, I mean, it is important, isn't it? What's on the label should marry up with what's in the product. It's unfortunate if that isn't the case. There are lots of products on the market now, as you've mentioned. The one that we use in our lab is Beat It, and before we provide the supplements to our experimental volunteers, then we always measure the nitrate content, and it does always marry up with what's on the label. So that's we're confident that that's the case. So that's the only one that I really have any experience with.
Perfect. So one of the main points that I'm genuinely interested in having your insights, Andrew, is on the ergogenic benefit in trained versus untrained subjects. And this is something that Dr. Trent Stellingworth made allusion to when he was here on the podcast back on episode 17, talking about nutrition for altitude training. So it would seem that trained subjects, I don't know if the VO2 max established to set this was above 50 or 75. Nonetheless, endurance trained individuals appear to benefit less from nitrate supplementation, similarly to most supplements really, perhaps due to the fact that this reduction in oxygen cost of exercise is already a normal adaptation in these athletes. So since elite cyclists are known to have really high VO2 max values, would you say that they would experience less of an ergogenic benefit?
Yes, but I mean, the only thing I'd say is, I mean, Trent is right there. But again, going back to the meta-analysis, the cutoff seems to be 65 mils per kilogram per minute. So the studies that they included in the meta-analysis, when the subjects had VO2 max values of more than 65, then on average there was no significant benefit of nitrate supplementation. Anything less than 65, and there was. So unless you have the great fortune of having a VO2 max of over 65, then the chances are that it could actually still be beneficial for you. So that's a higher level of aerobic fitness than many of us thought might be the case. But yeah, you wouldn't expect it to be quite so dramatic when you've got in really highly trained endurance athletes, when they've done so much, they're genetically blessed and they've done so much in their training to optimize their physiology and their performance. It would be surprising if you could find anything that would boost their performance by more than a fraction of a percent. So it's not too surprising. That said, like I've mentioned already, there does seem to be quite a lot of variability between people. So just because on average people who have a high VO2 max don't benefit doesn't mean that individual athletes might not enjoy some benefit. So that's important, and it might be related to the bacteria, it might be related to the transport of nitrate from the blood to the muscle. There's probably no harm in elite athletes using nitrate to support their training and prior to competition anyway. But it's something that's worth having a look at. That's all I would say. We did a lot of work back in the day looking at how manipulating the warm-up might influence the performance. And in some cases it does, in some cases it doesn't. But it's one of those things that's not going to do you any harm to experiment with and to give it a try. And there are lots of athletes, whether they're recreational or elite, who do seem to believe that nitrate is beneficial to their performance. Eliud Kipchoge, interestingly, is one of them.
Yes, and since you've been insisting a lot in this idea of variability between athletes, would you say that there might be an intra-variability as well? I mean, one athlete not benefiting in one specific day and then in a different day with a different type of effort, we can suddenly see a beneficial effect?
Yeah, and I think some people have proposed that one way to investigate nitrate as an ergogenic aid, or in fact many other supplements, is to look at what happens on a repeated basis in individual athletes, some sort of like a case series, because it's all very well talking about inter-individual variability, but sometimes that's just noise in the data. And what you want to be certain of is that some people are consistently responding or consistently not responding. So the extent to which there may be variability within an individual's performance from day to day has really not been quantified so far. So it's an excellent point, I think, that we ought to address.
Well, hopefully that research is performed in the next couple of years as a case series, as you've suggested. That would be really nice to see. And besides this, considering what we were talking before, that women are often underrepresented in much of the literature regarding different ergogenic substances, would you say that there are any sex differences observed in the ergogenic effects with nitrate supplementation?
Yeah, well, it's probably too early to say. There's meta-analysis comes up again, and when the studies that were looked at, which had only included women, there was no significant effect. The direction was still in the right direction. There still seemed to be a tendency towards a benefit, but it wasn't statistically significant, and that's because there are fewer subjects and fewer studies done so far. I must say that in our hands, when we've studied female athletes alongside male athletes, then we don't see any difference in the responsiveness. But the way that blood pressure changes following nitrate supplementation has been proposed to be a bit different in females than males as well. So whether there's some innate difference in the way that dietary nitrate is processed in females compared to males, we're not absolutely sure. There's some hints that may be the case, and if that's true, then you might also expect there to be differences in potential ergogenic effects, but too early to say. And as I've mentioned, we don't find any dramatic difference in the responsiveness of men versus women in our lab.
Well, let's hope we can repeat this interview in 5 years and see if we can update our knowledge then. So moving on to altitude training camps, something that it's really relevant in the world of cycling as preparation for Grand Tours. And again, I must make reference to Trent Stellingworth. So one of the things he made reference to was the fact that when training at altitude, it may be counterproductive to use beetroot juice, suggesting that chronic nitrate intake could attenuate training adaptations by decreasing the drop in arterial oxygen saturation factor that serve as signals for hypoxic adaptations. So would you agree with Trent that it might be counterproductive to supplement with nitrates during altitude training camps?
Yeah. One of the things that you get with beetroot juice is an oxygen preserving effect, for want of a better phrase. So you become more efficient. And so there have been some studies with breath hold, for example, but also looking at resting metabolic rate. And you can imagine a scenario where in hypoxia, your arterial oxygen saturation is better maintained if you've supplemented with nitrate. So the signal that would be necessary to start that cascade of events, which ends in erythropoiesis, might be disrupted. So, I agree that taking nitrate chronically while at altitude could undermine some of the effects that you've gone there to try to create. Actually, it may be helpful in the first couple of days, though, just to kind of help you bed into the altitude. And also, one of the problems with training at altitude is that the intensity of your training can become downplayed as well, because it's obviously harder to exercise at altitude than people's the intensity tends to be reduced. And if you're maybe the same in cycling, I presume, but with runners, what they tend to do is come down the mountain and do their speed sessions at a lower altitude in order to make sure that they can still get the adaptations that are necessary from the high intensity aspects of the training. What you could do with nitrate is use it acutely. If you're on let's say an 8-week training block at altitude, and you want to make sure that you get the most benefit from an intense interval type training session that you're intending to perform, that isn't adversely influenced by the fact that you're at altitude, then you could use it acutely prior to that session. But I do agree that it's probably not sensible to use nitrate over that entire period, because you might blunt the hematological adaptations that you were hoping to achieve.
Nice. It's definitely an interesting use of nitrate supplementation in the first days of altitude exposure to sort of help with the transition. And Andrew, just before wrapping up here, when facing a competition like a Grand Tour or other multi-stage racing event in cycling, what would you say that would be an ideal supplementation protocol to consider, whether it is acute or chronic, and what performance aspects should we expect to be improved?
Yeah, well, nobody's done it, so it would be speculation, of course. But I would say in that situation that at least a daily shot of beetroot juice or consuming a high nitrate diet would be beneficial. Taking some nitrate acutely a couple of hours before the start of the race. Nitrate in the muscle is likely to be depleted over the course of the day, and maybe re-establishing that with a high nitrate meal or another beetroot juice shot at the end of the day wouldn't be a bad thing either. I mentioned that one study where we were looking at feeding nitrate during exercise, and that did seem to have some benefits. I think that's the only study to date which has looked at that. We did find in an earlier study that when we looked at 50-mile time trial performance, that the individuals who increased their blood nitrate concentration more with the supplement were able to improve their performance more compared to a placebo. So there are some hints out there that even very long duration cycling might be beneficial. We also found, because you're talking, if you're exercising day after day after day, we did do some studies over 4 weeks where we gave nitrate every day and also prescribed a interval training program. And the metabolic adaptations that occurred as a consequence of the training program, were augmented in the group that simultaneously supplemented with nitrate compared to a placebo. So there may be some gains to be had there too. So that would be my guess. If I were working as a nutritionist for a cycling team, would be to certainly to use nitrate, to make sure that there's sufficient nitrate in the diet on all days, and probably to use a beetroot juice supplement a couple of hours before the races start each day.
And another thing that just popped into my mind is that cyclists, much like many other athletes when competing, are also taking many other supplements. So I wonder if there are any additive effects or supplements that shouldn't be used alongside nitrate, let's say caffeine, for example.
No, not really, no. Nitrate and caffeine work through different mechanisms, and they shouldn't interfere with one another. The one ergogenic aid that may not mix well with nitrate would be sodium bicarbonate. Now, I don't know if that's something that's likely to be used in the sorts of scenarios where you've described anyway. But of course, if you reduce the acidity, you make the blood more alkaline, you make the mouth more alkaline potentially as well, then the opportunity for nitrate to be effective may be blunted, because as we've mentioned, the nitrite to nitric oxide reduction is accentuated when you've got low oxygen levels and actually low pH as well. So if you elevate the pH prior to exercise with a buffer like sodium bicarbonate, then you may thwart the effects that nitrate could have. So it depends on the event. There are certain events, obviously, where buffering of acidity is the key consideration, and in that case, the bicarb should take the priority. But in other events where acidity is not the likely main cause of fatigue, then nitrate may be the one that you would use, and you wouldn't take the bicarb simultaneously. There may not be too many events where you'd think you could get a benefit from taking both at the same time anyway.
Well, fantastic insights, Andrew. I really never thought about it before, and it's definitely an important consideration. Not that sodium bicarbonate is a popular supplement anyway, which is a shame. And in fact, we insisted in this point back on episode 15 with Dr. Brian Saunders, where we talk about buffer agents in cycling, which included beta-alanine and sodium bicarbonate supplementation. Andrew, I almost feel bad in asking you this because in the last 5 minutes or so, you pretty much summarized everything there is to know about nitrates. And so, I don't know, if you could just leave us with some take-home messages regarding this topic or aspects that might have been mentioned here on this episode and that you would like to see answered in the next 5 to 10 years.
Oh, that's a tough one. We've covered a lot of ground this afternoon. I still think this is a very interesting area. I'm still as stimulated by researching in this field as I was back then. There's lots of unanswered questions. When we did our first study with beetroot juice following the study from the Karolinska Institute, to be honest, I didn't think we'd be able to reproduce their findings. They were so surprising to me that I thought there must be some error in there. So I was stunned when we found the same thing. And of course, it's opened up a lot of other exciting possibilities since then. It's a story that keeps changing. We've gone, where the focus was on endurance, and now we're finding that sprint and multiple sprint sports can benefit as well. There are intrinsic benefits to muscle contractile function, it seems. And the new horizons for us is looking at muscle nitrate and how that's stored, how nitrate is metabolized in muscle, how it can be altered by diet and training. We think there's this whole interaction between the mouth, the circulation, and the muscle. Nitrate, nitrite, and NO are produced endogenously all the time. They can be supplemented exogenously through the diet, and there's this whole chain of events that we don't quite understand where all of these things are operating synergistically. So trying to tease that out is going to be really important. To what extent does muscle use nitrate or nitrite during exercise? How much nitrate or nitrite goes into muscle? How much comes out? What happens to muscle nitrate and nitrite concentrations during exercise of different intensities and durations are all questions that I think are really important and exciting and that we want to do, really, essentially. So, in terms of take-home messages, I think this is probably the newest nutritional ergogenic aid out there. It doesn't work for everybody all of the time, and that's the same for all of the ergogenic aids as well. But it does seem to have potential. I've not lost faith in the value that it can have, and it can support health. It's not something that's going to be detrimental, we believe, to performance at any time, and it's something that even elite athletes can potentially benefit from. So it's something that I would encourage everybody to at least explore to find whether they're one of the people that respond.
Terrific. So, Andrew, I think your social media Twitter handle was already left quite clear, but for all of those who didn't catch it, what would be the best way or social media network to keep up with your updates?
Yeah, probably Twitter is my main mode of communication with the outside world, and my Twitter name is @AndyBeetroot.
That surely is catchy. And as usual, I'll make sure to include those links in the show notes of this present episode 32 on feelthepedal.com. And Andrew, this was just phenomenal. I think you've said it all regarding the role of nitrate supplementation for endurance sports, in particular cycling, and hopefully the listeners have now a much clearer understanding about their role so that they can include more nitrates, whether it is in a supplemental form or through dietary intake in their training protocols. And for that, Andrew, thank you for your time and amazing insights.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it. I hope your listeners find it useful.
Wow. It was such an honor to perform this interview with a researcher that I truly admire and who's been giving such an important contribution to this and many other areas. I hope you've enjoyed this one as much as I did. Thank you again for tuning in to Feel the Pedal. Let me know what you thought about it, and if you know anyone who you think that might listen to this episode or benefit from nitrate supplementation, feel free to retweet it or share it through any other platform if you so desire. I'm Gabriel Martins signing off and coming back soon with a brand new episode. Stay safe, guys.